What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, we're going to be covering a viewer requested topic, which is a topic that I've covered a few times on the channel before, but it can't hurt to have an updated video on this topic. In MLB The Show 23, they're asking how exactly do you go about placing your players in the minor league system? Which overalls, which potentials, and those types of things are going to be at each level in your system? And this is actually a relatively easy breakdown. It kind of depends a little bit on what your team looks like. So that's one factor I want you to consider. So if you're a rebuilding organization like the Pittsburgh Pirates, your farm system might look a little bit different than one of the top tier teams in the league, like the Padres or one of the most OP teams that are out there. Generally speaking, it's just going to flow on a level basis by 26 players in your organization. So the top 26 overall players within your organization should be pretty much at the MLB level. Now, you might have some mixing in there. You might have a couple of prospects that aren't quite ready. You want them to develop a little bit more in the minor leagues, and so they're not going to be up at the MLB yet. And you might be relying on some lower overall players at the MLB level that are going to be helping you right now, but might not be in your long-term plans. So if we take a look at our actual roster, if you go to your roster in franchise mode, you can use the L1 and R1 buttons to scroll over, and you can do more than just look at positions. You can actually look at your MLB roster, your AAA roster, your AA roster, so on and so forth. And this is going to allow you to have a very good look at what this is supposed to look like within your franchise mode. So for the Pittsburgh Pirates, for example, of course, all of my 80 plus overall players are going to be up at the major league level. But if we go down to the bottom of my MLB roster, you can see that it's mostly going to be some 70s, high 70s for the most part, but a couple of complementary low 70s players, and here and there a 60 overall player that's helping me at a specific position. Generally speaking, anybody that's going to be a high overall is going to be at your MLB level. And this is going to be different for other teams within the MLB. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. If we take a look at a team like the Angels, for example, they are not necessarily the most OP team within the game right now, especially within my franchise mode, but they are actually the only MLB team on this roster in my franchise mode that only has one 60s overall player on their roster. And to be honest with you, Trevor May probably started off in the 70s. You can see that his overall went down a bit. So this is what a really good MLB roster is going to look like. It's going to look like a bunch of 80s, a few 90s mixed in, and then mostly supporting cast players that are going to be in the high 70s. So that kind of gives you your jumping off point for the minor league system and what that's going to look like. Generally speaking, you're going to be looking at players that are in the high 60s and into the 70s for AAA ball players. So going back to the Pittsburgh Pirates, for example, I'll show you exactly what that's going to look like. For my minor league system, right now I have a few players that are in the low 70s, and mostly it's going to be players in that 65 to 70 overall range. This is not a perfect farm system by any means because, again, I have to complement with a few lower overall players at positions of need. So you'll see that I have a couple of lower 60s players in here, but it's a majority of players that are a 65 overall or higher. So the best way to think about this, again, is like a tier. You can go look at any of the other teams' rosters and you'll be able to see kind of how that's broken down. So you're looking at anybody that's a 75 and above should be in consideration to be on your MLB roster. So that's 75 all the way up to 99. And to be 100% honest with you, anybody that's above a 79 overall should be on your major league roster because they're just not going to be able to progress in the minor leagues. There's kind of a limit to how much players can progress at each level, and you're going to be sacrificing on progression if you don't continue to move them up, even if their performance is not matching what their overall is looking like. So for example, if you have a player that's in your minor league systems that is getting up into the mid to high 70s, and you don't see a whole lot of progression out of them anymore, it's simply because they can't get anything more out of the minor league system. As you see here with the Pittsburgh Pirates, anybody that's approaching those mid 70s, I'm probably going to try to find room for them on my roster as long as I know that they're in my future plans. That's kind of where you're at with the minor league system. And then you go to to the AAA system, like I said, and you're looking at players under that 75 overall threshold. So about a 65 to a 75. That's a 10 overall point range that you're looking at for those minor league players. Again, you got to complement on both ends of those things. You might have a player that's up in the majors that might need to come down for an injury rehabilitation or something like that. That's kind of a realistic thing that you might do in franchise mode if you're trying to be realistic. Or, you might have to complement, like I said, with some of these lower overall players because, for example, my catchers just might not be that good. My farm system might just not have very good catchers, and so my AAA catchers have to be these 60 overall players because I really don't have anything else to put there. But then that really also brings you down to your AA roster, which again is going to come from that same jumping off point. So from here, you will see that I have a couple of higher 60 overall players, a 65, a 66, and a couple of 64s. You might be asking yourself, okay, well, why aren't those 65s and 66 up at the AAA level over players at the bottom here like these 60s and 61s? Well, it's a positional basis. I still have to field X number of relief pitchers. I still have to field 2 catchers. And so I can't just simply take my best players here in AA and move them up for the catchers because they're not going to play catcher. And I can't just move my starting pitchers up there for those relief spots because that's not necessarily what I want them doing. I want them playing as starting pitchers, and so they're playing down here in the AA level. Nonetheless, though, you're going to be looking at a majority of players that are below a 65 overall. And that's exactly what you're going to see here with this roster. All of these players pretty much are going to be between a 55 and a 65. Again, it's going to be about that 10-point range where these players are going to be fitting into that AA system. And again, just because those players don't fall within that 55 to 65 range does not mean that they can't have some success at that level. But again, as you start to get players that are into the higher 60s, you're really going to want to start to move them up in the system because they're going to start to not benefit as much in development from being down here at a lower level. At the bottom of my roster here, though, in AA, you will see a couple of players that are below that 55 threshold. There's something to consider here is that these players are just simply probably not going to perform as well because of their low overall. You guys can see Winston Landis here, for example, is batting .275 on the season, and that's probably a product of his athleticism, and he has a half-decent bat for a low overall AA player, but again, you're probably not going to get a crazy amount of production out of some of these players. These players are actually playing pretty good, and there's actually good reason to have them up in that AA system because these guys have A and B potential. And that's the other aspect to talk about here. You want to make sure that all of your A and B potential prospects are in your AA and AAA system. So while this guy might be a 46 overall and this guy might be a 52 overall, I might be forcing them to play at a level that's above what they're really capable of. Even though we can see on the screen they're both actually performing pretty well, you still want them to be in that system because playing time is the single most important factor to players developing within MLB The Show. And you don't play games on the single A roster. So while I have a 59 overall, a 58 overall, a 54, a 54, and a 52, these players are not on my AA roster simply because I'm trying to get these other guys playing time and I want them to develop. Now that I'm actually taking a look at it, I might want to try to find a spot for Scott Felch, for example, because he does have that A potential. Or I might want to try to find a spot for Tommy Kang because he has B potential. Unfortunately, overall on my roster, I just have so many left fielders, center fielders, just outfielders in general, that it makes it pretty difficult for me to force every single one of those players to be in my minor league farm system. When it really comes down to it, you're ultimately going to be making decisions between a couple of players, and you also want your farm system to have success because playing well and winning games and getting to the playoffs in the minor leagues is going to translate to better development for your players. So I could look at my single A roster and see that I have those couple of players in Tommy Kang and Scott Felch that could be up in my minor league system and developing better. But then I have to look at the players that are in front of them. Well, I know that I'm not going to get a ton out of Ryan Vilade. I know I'm not going to get a ton out of Chavez Young in the long run. But they're still 64 overalls, so they might be providing more to my farm system, and now that I look at it, their performance isn't all that great, so I might make that switch. But a 64 overall as compared to a 50 overall, that's quite a big difference. And so you might be considering, yeah, I should have this guy up, even though the other guy has better potential. There's a couple of factors to consider there, but a general guideline to go by is exactly what I just talked about. You want to try to have your A's and B's in the farm system as much as possible, and you want to try to make sure that your AA players are in that 55 to 65 range, roughly, give or take on both ends. You want to make sure that your AAA players are 65 to 75 overall, and you want to make sure that those players that are bordering on that 80 overall are getting up to your major league level. Like I said, that might change depending on your team, especially if you play with a really good team. If you manage to stack your team really well, you might end up with a bunch of 79 overalls in your AAA system. You might end up with some 70 overalls in your AA system. That just kind of depends on what your team looks like. So again, go through your roster and break it down. If the lowest overall player on my MLB roster is a 79, then that kind of shifts the spectrum a little bit. And so instead of my AAA roster being from a 65 to a 75, my AAA roster might be a 69 to a 79, and my AA roster therefore might be a 59 to a 68 or something like that. So you do have to kind of put your own little bit of spin on it, but those are the general guidelines that I like to give you guys, and that has not really changed for MLB The Show 23. It's kind of the same concept that it has always been for years and years and years now. There's a pretty consistent spectrum that your players are going to want to look like in each of your farm system levels, and you can, like I said, go to the roster and sort by other teams, pick out a team that you know is good, and take a look at what they have going on. Take a look at what they're doing with their AAA roster, for example. Take a look at what they're doing with their AA roster and try to compare to what you're doing with yours, and that'll give you a good guideline of what to look for. Again, just flipping right over to another AAA roster, you can kind of see that all these players are below a 75 overall, and most of them are above a 65. They only have a couple of players here that are below a 65, and they're just complementing a couple of positions that probably need another player at that position. So it's really straightforward. I hope that this video was helpful to you and gave you all the information that you could use. Again, if you guys are new here, please subscribe and leave a like down below. It helps out the channel tremendously. I hope you guys will stick around for another video, but as always, I'll see you in the next video, and I hope you have a good one.